Hello, and welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. Each month, we look back at games played by Gauntlet folks. My name is Lowell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm joined today by my two co-hosts, Shane.
Hi, Lowell. How you doing?
Good. And Sherri.
Hello. Pleasure to be here.
For our first segment, each of us gets to go over the games that we played sort of in November, December. If you've listened to the podcast, you know we did a number of special episodes and things. So we're kind of covering that last quarter, whatever we want to talk about from that. We're going to go over what we played, and then we're going to talk in depth about one of those games that we played on the Gauntlet calendar. So Shane, tell us how your gaming was over this wide-ranging period.
So November and December were quieter months for me. I was really winding down for the year. I don't think I played anything off the Gauntlet those 2 months, but on the Gauntlet, I had a run of Monster Hearts and of iHunt, which I loved. It ended up being my game of the year, if people want to go back to last episode. And in December, I ran a couple of sessions of Knights Black Agents Solo Ops. And that's the game that I want to talk about in a bit more detail. So Knights Black Agents Solo Ops, well, the core Knights Black Agents, the original OG Knights Black Agents, is a gumshoe game about spies fighting vampires, or really fighting a sort of vast, terrifying vampiric conspiracy. Solo Ops is a version of that that's designed for just one player and one GM, rather than a traditional role-playing group or party. And the scenario that I ran from the Knights Black Agents Solo Ops core book was called Never Say Dead, and the premise of this game is that the character that you play, a pregen called Layla Khan, wakes up in hospital, no real memory of how she got there or why there's a bullet in her side, but pretty quickly realizes that there are vampires coming for her and has to figure out what's been going on and what's happening. So what worked for me? The first thing that I'll say is that it really made me realize that vampires versus spies is a fun concept for a game.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's not obvious or intuitive to me why that works, but I've noticed, like, Knights Black Agents is a pretty big game. There are at least 2 people on the Gauntlet who've created their own hack of Knights Black Agents because they are interested enough in that experience. I'm not really familiar with any texts, movies, books, anything like that that have a similar premise. It's not an obvious one the way fantasy is as a genre or some of the other cosmic horror stuff. So yeah, I just it is fun to play an extremely competent spy on the run trying to untangle a vampiric conspiracy. That's a good time. The specific setup for Never Say Dead, that you're sort of waking from this quasi-amnesia, I thought that was really smart.
Yeah.
Because it gives you a lot of scope as a player. You are stuck with this pregen. If there's only one pregen to pick with, it could sort of really narrow your options, but because she has amnesia, there's just a lot of scope for the player to define what Layla Khan is like. I ran 2 sessions with 2 different players, so basically going over the same material. It was really interesting to see the quite different ways they set out her personality and her approaches to things and stuff like that. The number one thing that worked for me about this game, the thing that games like this have over all other games, is scheduling. The true terror of all role-playing games trying to schedule, and especially to reschedule. When I've missed a session on the Gauntlet, it's almost always been pretty impossible or extremely difficult to reschedule because you're trying to work with 4 or 5 people's schedules. They're in different time zones. Both of these sessions of Solo Ops, I did have to reschedule, and in both cases, I just sent an email to the person, the only other person in the game, saying, I can play this time, or this time, what's good for you? They picked the one that worked for them, and it was just incredibly easy to reschedule. And I mean, this is really why I was interested in these games in the first place, because one of the players in my regular home group recently had a baby and isn't going to be as available to play on a regular schedule, but I'd really like to keep playing with him. So I think something like this, which is a campaign that you can play out, but is just one-on-one, much easier to move around and reschedule, I think that will be a really good option for us. Maybe not this game exactly, but something similar, something along those lines. I really like the way the game sets out the investigative skills. So people probably know the basic way that Gumshoe works is that if you have a skill, you get the clue. That's the core hook or premise. This game sets you up with your sort of core spy skills, and you pick a couple of the more specific skills, whether that's biology or art history or some of those more specialized things. But it also gives you a general ability for networking. So when you come to a clue that you can't actually get for yourself because there's no one else in the party to lean on for that, you get to roll networking. You basically just introduce an NPC who can help you with that thing, either because they owe you or at a cost of some kind. I think that's really smart. It's a good way to keep NPCs coming into the game. You can really imagine a game like this not having a lot of roleplay opportunities because you're shooting everyone who you have to deal with. But this is a good way to get allies who you can actually have some interactions with. The way that general abilities work in this game, I think, is quite smart as well. So general abilities are the ones that do have a prospect of failure in core Gumshoe games. They don't really have a prospect of failure in solo ops. They have tiered successes, probably in a similar way to what people would be familiar with from PBTA games. You can roll a setback, which is more like what would be considered a success with a complication or cost in a PBTA game. You can roll a hold, which is a basic success, or you can roll an advance, which is a success where you get something extra. So I think that is smart. Like, obviously, if only one person's rolling and you can fail, there's a real risk of the game just shutting down. So keeping things moving in that way, I think, is really smart. It's also interesting that it's basically a dice pool mechanic, so you're trying to hit certain thresholds for those things. So if you roll a 3 or less, that's a setback. If you roll a 9 or over, that's an advance. But the cool thing is that you roll those dice one at a time. So you roll your first dice, maybe you're happy with that result, maybe you want to try and do better. You have to think about what you're willing to give up to get that second dice, and then maybe a third dice. When I played this with Robbie, he was rolling terribly, just the longest series of ones on a d6 that I've ever seen. And so just, having to really scrabble for those extra dice, like, built some interesting tension into the dice rolling itself. What I'm less sure about, I think these games do have a problem with information design. I think that's true for a lot of Gumshoe. Now I'm talking more about the adventure content, the mysteries. Scenes are set out in just pages of fairly densely typed paragraphs. There's some subheadings, but not really breaking up it as much as I'd like. It's very hard to find information that you need quickly at the table, I find. The challenges themselves. So I talked about the things that are good about the dice rolls. The thing that is not so good about the dice rolls is they are very scripted and structured, which makes it just hard to improvise or hard to deal with if the player decides to do something different, which of course the player will decide to do something different. This is pretty similar to what I said about the Yellow King role-playing game, which is another Gumshoe game, so I won't rehash that too much. But I think there is a lot of scope there to just sort of borrow some tech from story games to open that stuff up more, rather than needing to script your challenge in advance with what the problem is that you can take on for an extra d6. Just let them come up with a devil's bargain or something like that. Let them decide in the moment between you and the player what the extra bonus that you get on your 12 plus is, rather than scripting that out. I think all of that stuff would make for a freer flowing game that is more to my taste.
To piggyback onto what you said about the information design, yeah, there are times when there would be key things that you needed to tell the players within a scene. And I'm not just talking clues, but like physical details and things like that are in there that because there's so much text, it's easy to lose track of those. And then suddenly realize, this is something that the players need to know, or I've got to completely drop it.
Yes, absolutely. So my takeaway overall for the game, I do like the way it's set up. I can't imagine playing this out as a campaign. I can see that I might do that at some point. The main takeaway from the information design for me is that games like this are designed for people who either just have a much better memory than I do, or who are much better at taking notes and doing prep, and probably that enjoy doing prep more than I do. But I do think there's scope, like I said, to take what's cool about this game and blend it just with some mechanics and ideas from story games and make something that's both easier to prep and much more dynamic and interactive and weird in the ways that I like in a game.
It is interesting, after your experience with Yellow King and all the cards in that, you went with the other game that I thought actually had more cards.
Look, I decided not to talk about the cards because I complained about the cards so much last time. The cards are worse in this game, but also overwhelmingly unnecessary. Just pretend there's no cards.
Yeah.
That does get to another information design issue, which is that sometimes essential content in a scene is split between the adventure text and a card that they get in the scene, which I think is just a wild decision. But just pretend there's no cards. There's no cards in this game, okay?
I just, the sessions that we played in, I would get all these little cards and I'm like, this card doesn't do anything for me. I'll never use this card.
One thing that was cool is that I just sent the players like all of the cards in advance so they could like reference them. Robbie had them all printed out before him because it kind of gives you this like weird like premonition of ways the game might go. So I thought that was quite cool that he had this like shadow game in his head.
I had printed them out for Sherri and then carefully collated and arranged them. And the reason that we never played a second session is that she dropped them.
The cat ran into it, like ran across it, and it flew onto the floor, and like they all just, yeah, it was like confetti in the office.
I couldn't bear to sort them, so we just didn't go back. That says more about me than anything, I think, right there.
Otherwise, I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Sherri, how was your November, December?
Oh, is much like Shane, my November and December were lighter. I did have some off-gauntlet games, played Apocalypse Keys, played Mage PBTA, played, of course, more Hearts of Wulin, because I'm never not playing Hearts of Wulin. And then on Gauntlet, I played Hearts of Wulin, the Mystery Hack. We played Subvergence. And then the game that I'm going to talk about, Trouble for Hire, but of course a Star Wars Saturday version, because that is whenever I'm playing some kooky small game, it's almost always Star Wars themed, because I have my Saturday mornings free. So thank you, Rich. Essentially, Trouble for Hire is a GM-less RPG that was originally intended to take players through a sort of grindhouse movie following a badass drug courier named Ruben Carlos Reese through a deal gone bad against supposedly insurmountable odds. This was a Kickstarter project from 2018 by NDP Design, which is Nathan Paoletta, who did World Wide Wrestling. So his publishing arm, and it was authored by Kevin Allen Jr., who wrote Sweet Agatha, which was like a 2009 Diana Jones Award nominee, two-player RPG that was very interesting. But this game, Trouble for Hire, it's available on DriveThruRPG and on the publisher's site, which is ndpdesign.com. It's an interesting GM-less thing because essentially what's going on is there's a currency. Almost all GM-less games have some sort of currency or token system. So this one does too. They're called RPMs. There are 8 roles that players can choose from. And essentially switching between those as you pick a role, there's the currency that you get where if a role hasn't been used, there's some extra currency waiting for you when you choose to play that role in a given scene. And then to do things in your roles, you are spending that currency or giving currency to another player in order to do whatever your effect is. And I want to go through these roles so you get a sense of what's happening here of like, if you're a player, you're going to be doing one of these. Well, we only use 7 of the 8 roles. So one of these 7 things in this thing. So Las Compañero, which is the sidekick. So the foil of Ruben's right-hand man, whether he likes you or not, whether he intended for you to be going along with him, you are the sidekick and you're there in that scene. And you have essentially the ability to help Ruben out. But otherwise, you're just in there causing trouble for him for the most part. You can play the road through the world. You're the clouds in the sky, the dirt in the ground, and all the things in between. You're essentially describing the scenery and the whatever is in the world that is an obstacle or comes into and onto the screen. Think of it that everything is very much in that film paradigm. You might be La Villanos, which is the villains, the henchmen, the minions, and all the hell that comes with them. So you could be the bad guys, and you're all the bad guys. So you're describing all the things that they're doing, their plots, their plans, their scenes when they break in, who they shoot at, everything. You can be the spectators. These are the people who are neither for you or against you. They're just everyone else in the world, the people who witness what's going on and how they react. There's the editor. That's the way the DJ scratches the record, it says. That's the editor of the story. So this is the one who's doing the cuts on the scenes and is like adding special effects and doing all the crazy things. And they can drastically change how the story is going as far as the other roles are selected. So this is a person who gets in there and they're going to change the course of the story. And then there's the weirdness, the la extrano, and that's the strange, the unknowable, the weirdness of the universe. And of course, in the Star Wars universe, we read that mostly as the Force and how that came in. And then, of course, there's Ruben himself. He's the protagonist. So he's one role. And essentially what has happened is all these roles have wildly asymmetrical abilities with their tokens, okay, with those RPM and how they use them and how they generate them and what they're doing with them. And as you go through this thing, for every role, whenever you may hand out RPM if that's part of your role for certain things, and then you change stuff in the scene when you do that. That allows you to do things. But it's when you spend RPM, you mark a checkbox, and that moves the scene that you're in towards its end. So essentially what's happening is you're never doing one scene for too very long, because every time you do anything for your role, you spend some of that RPM, you're heading there towards the end. It has this thing where it gets breakneck every additional scene. You're like already, before you even get into the scene, you've probably already spent some of its RPM, and everything is just going faster and faster. And you're trying to get something in that scene before you're out of the scene and your budget's used up or you've spent on before. It starts with a set of themes. These are really critical. The themes are a thing that at any point you can describe those or invoke those in your descriptions in the role, and they give you some of that RPM back that you can spend if you've run out. But they're also a really fun way to steer what the scenes are going to be about. And then between each scene, there are incentives to change the roles again. And since everyone spends RPMs in wildly different ways, it's like a crazy, okay, now this person is doing this, and they have a completely different approach to it. So the story is, Ruben is one kind of person in one scene, or very different in another scene. And it's really fun. So these sessions were interesting because the story really clipped along. It took a few exchanges in each of the roles to see how things worked. But once we were underway, the scenes sped by really fast, faster even than we realized. The starting themes were, what do you believe or put your faith in? Poverty, or dust, smoke, obscured vision. So these are great themes. Essentially, since the game is set in a desert, the obscured vision kicked things off, and we instinctively started out with a very visual style and fell into describing things much like you would in movie scenes. Each of the roles that we took ended up being delightful, and they all had their own quirks, responsibilities, and ways to tweak the story or the other roles. And since each of the players are also very different, you have any one of those roles recurring did not give you a particularly predictable set of things that were going to happen. It was all over the place in a crazy way. Story had a real strange shifting focus, unresolved artiness, a quick cut feel of a grindhouse film. We'd try to resolve things with but wait, and then we do this, and then we do this, but all that did was it meant we'd spend more RPM into the next scene, and the next scene hardly got a chance to breathe before we were into the scene after it. So it had that, we have no budget, we're just going to put a little bit in here to signify that this thing happened, and then we're on. It felt very grindhouse in that way. It was super fun to try all the roles. It was cool to see which players sang in which roles. Each of the roles has a different aesthetic sense, a different pace, different concerns. So there was a bit of an inadvertent education and visual narrative that went along with playing the role as well. It was interesting. I really enjoyed that. The roles and the RPM did a lot to mitigate the hesitancy that pops up in a lot of GM-less game experiences that I've been in. So that was interesting. But you had a different little hesitation as people had to understand what their currency was doing with each role too. But it was a tiny payback as opposed to the big hesitation where everyone looks around and goes, is it me? Is it you? Is it me? So that was nice. If there are things that I was less sure about, it was that the game materials were clearly designed for play at the table because, well, hello, 2018. I do remember you in 2018 fondly, but now my concern is that it's a little harder to swap those roles and stuff online. Where you would at the table be able to pick up a nice slick little card that had everything you needed. We were sort of squinting at a JPEG and trying to read it. Rich did a great job of trying to make that as easy as possible for us to do the switching, but anything that made it easier also tended to cut down on what was really some excellent graphic design that had been put into the product to begin with. So we had this kind of thing of where things were easier, they weren't as gorgeous as they had originally been. So we had to give up on some of the aesthetic on that side. The different roles worked best with quite different play styles. Cody and Sabine and Rich, my fellow players, shone very brightly in roles that I felt merely adequate in, whereas I did feel like I got some cool bits on the roles that suited my approach to that sort of baby chaos of the GM-less table. So there is a thing of you're going to be playing things, and you may pick up a role that you go, oh, I feel like I'm really bad at it, but it doesn't matter because everyone else is doing stuff too. Nothing depends solely on you, and that's a nice thing about this. Grindhouse films have discontinuities and scenes that end abruptly and appear to have no purpose or end in ways that the lead-up didn't promise, and this game can do all that too. So if you really like tidy, cohesive story, you will, with the explicit permission of this game, be disappointed. So I just want you to know that. But my takeaway is that this is probably in my top 3 of GM-less games that I've played. The RPM system and the roles steered past so many potholes in that GM-less road. The themes, the Grindhouse movie ethos, the roles, the forced scene changes are brilliant. And it may still feel like a mess when you're in the middle of it, but it is a thematic mess with spots of brilliance and some wacky transitions. And it was just a very striking game. And the Star Wars made it fun. It was fun to do Our Weirdness Be the Force and things like that, but I would have enjoyed it in its original theming as well. Any questions?
You say that thing about the games that are designed for the tabletop, and I'm thinking about the games that we've gotten from Kickstarter, or I've pre-ordered like Cobwebs and King is Dead and Spectaculars and Jiangxi that all have lots of physical artifacts, and I think that it's so weird to get those now.
It is. I'm like, is there a link for your character keepers somewhere? Where's it is a weird thing. That how much more difficult it is when you need something that's only available to you as a graphic.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you're having to do the scroll up to bigger and bigger so that you can see the fine text, because what works great on a piece of cardboard, you can hold it to where your eyes are focusing. It's not so awesome when you've got a monitor that's 2 feet from your face and 4 points font. So it's just a weird thing that I think designers couldn't have predicted in 2018. But as we go on further, there may be some need to start accommodating the idea that online is going to be a place where more people are playing.
It's always surprising to me that all kinds of games seem to write as if people are playing them around a table. And even before the pandemic, I just really don't think that was the most common situation for people to actually be playing in.
Agreed. All right. So I'm going to talk about my stuff. Part that I like the most. So my November, December off Gauntlet, I ran Apocalypse Keys in the latest playtest version. I talked about that in the last podcast episode. We got started on a mage PBTA game, and we did our Hearts of Wulin game. We're just getting started back into our face-to-face 13th Age game, but we missed like 2 months with the holidays and everything. But on Gauntlet, I did Hearts of Wulin with a Star Wars reskin. I did our Brindlewood Bay Hearts of Wulin mashup. I added some new things to that and tried that again. I ran 13th Age on the Gauntlet with Roll20. We did the last part of Virgins, which we've talked about before on the podcast. And then the one that I've been kind of really interested in, I'm glad I got onto the calendar, is Tachyon Squadron. So Tachyon Squadron is a supplement for Fate Core, nice little hardback, which has you as starfighter pilots who are part of an underdog star system that's caught between 2 warring larger factions who want your territory and resources. This is written by Clark Valentine, who has done a number of other Fate projects. I actually remember seeing him running it at Origins Games on Demand a few years ago, noting it because it required some physical tech that he had on the table, a map and pieces moving around. So the game itself is sort of space above and beyond that old series, or like X-Wing video games, or the Vipers from Battlestar Galactica. It's definitely leaning into the harder sci-fi. There's little in the way of sort of non-Terran races that are presented. It's a very classic humanity amongst the stars, and now they're fighting each other kind of thing. It's also a book that they have a number of supplements out for, providing other campaign frames. Though I ran it just using Google Sheets, there's a very nice setup for it on Roll20. In a minute, I'll talk about why that's important. What worked for me? I really like Fate. I like seeing how different people take on Fate, how they adjust it. I always appreciate when a game goes for a tighter, more economical set of skills with Fate, so that things cover a broader area. And this one has a nice set of skills. They're broken up into little categories. Like one is the 4 skills you need when you're in the pilot seat. There's another that's the physical, do stuff when you're outside of that. And then there's a kind of a social interaction mental set. Very nice, tight set of things. So I really like that. And they're written with the eye of somebody who's clearly played Fate and wants to get across, like, the name and the concept covers this amount of ground. It has a new idea in that it has equipment stunts, and these don't cost refresh. You can pick up equipment, you can find equipment, and equipment can do a particular thing rather than doing the classic sort of stunt features. One of the things you can do with equipment is when you roll with a particular skill to do a thing, you can maximize one of the fate dice, meaning you can turn it from a minus or a 0 to a plus. That feels really good. Like, it is a good way to get around some of the horrors of the fate dice for people who do not care for those. And Sherri is putting the thumbs up at this point. I like that we've got a kind of a structured play. We've got set up for the mission, the briefing. We go on a mission. We come back. We've got downtime. Downtime has a couple of phases. In particular, to clear stress from your character, you have to do stuff in the downtime to vent, either positively or negatively. You have to do that, and you have to do that right away, and there's a check for that. And so stress can kind of build up, and it builds a nice cycle for that, and it encourages certain kinds of role play. It's a really good cycle of play. All the phases of play matter, and they feel significant. There are too many of them. It takes a lead from Blades in the Dark, clearly, and those kinds of things, but it does it in a nice way. But the biggest thing is that it has a really robust dogfighting system. And what you've got is a chart, a kind of an altitude map. It's abstracted. It doesn't really measure altitude, but you've got a set of rows that go from like +9 to like -3, and there's kind of a special box at the top and the bottom. And when you go into combat, there's a roll for detection, and then there's a roll for maneuvering, and you get placed on that chart based on your maneuver roll. And the trick is that you can only shoot at something that is on your row or below. So there becomes this spatial thing about how do we maneuver down and how do we set. And at the end of like a round, you actually drift downward. So there's a kind of a downward movement. But there are a lot of ways to manipulate that. Rather than your standard, okay, take your action, go around, it's got a 2-phase system. And there are some things that can only be done in the first phase, and some things that can only be done in the second phase, and some things that take both phases to do. It's not too complicated. There's only like 5 or 6 choices on either of those, but they're really smartly done. Some of the things, like, let's say you want to get on someone's tail, you have to drop down just above them. So you may have to sacrifice some of your distance there, but then you get a significant bonus, and one that they have to deal with. They have to figure out how to get off your tail, and it builds some interesting choices throughout it. I used little images and a page on the Google spreadsheet to keep that and move that up and down and so on. It's solid. There's a lot of other interesting options to it that don't make it too complicated but add certain depth, like the enemies have fighter screens, meaning that there are secondary fighters that we don't actually put on the table, but they're advantages for the enemy pilots. So you may want to have to deal with them and get them out of the way so the enemy can't have access to those advantages. And there's different choices about how you handle that. It works. It's fun. It's more tactical and in-depth than most Fate play, and most than a lot of play I generally do with story games, but it doesn't feel like it overstays its welcome. One of the reasons being that there's some real tension created. If your ship gets hit at all, your pilot has to mark a point of stress, and you don't have that much stress, and that can build up. So even if your ship isn't getting damaged, you're getting knocked around. And then possibly when you get back to the station, you've got to figure out how to clear that out. So there's some really interesting choices for the gameplay. And while most of the play was in the ships doing missions, we had an on-the-ground session where they played their pilots trying to rescue people from a pirate base. That felt good too. A lot of the simplicity of the play of Fate really paid off because we were able to get through that quickly and then get back up and then do an escort mission, getting the rescuees up and out. So lots of good stuff there. What I am less sure about, I'm probably always going to say this with Fate games, but I would love more stunts. I would love more stunt examples. I know that there's some really easy formulas for that, but I like having those in there because it's an easier reference to present to the players, to give them some ideas and some different ways to go with that. There's a short equipment list with the stunts. I'd like more of those. This is not a less sure about, but boy, would I like kind of thing. The same with the spaceships and the spaceship equipment. More of that would be fun. There are some questions about order of presentation of information in the book. This is a small thing. When I was running, I'd have to look things up in the book, and several times, I couldn't find the rule that I was looking for. It is a question of order and presentation, where some of the key rules, I would like them to be a little more redundancy, like presented in a couple of places, and maybe some of those key aspects bolded out in some spots. It's a very minor thing, but particularly when I'm running online, I'm trying to keep that pace, and I'm looking at this book, I had a hard time with that because I'm an old person. And while I'm sure I could have looked it up in the PDF with a search thing, that did not even occur to me because I had the book in my hand. The last thing that I'll say, and I don't even know if this is a negative, but it was very clear as we went along that the players got better. They figured out how to use things. They figured out how to do stuff. They got proficiency. And for the last session, we had a new player come in. And you could see there's a whole learning curve thing that goes on there with that. I don't know if that's a negative, but it is a thing to be aware of, that unlike a lot of games, you need to figure out what is effective because some choices are suboptimal. Some choices aren't going to be helping in particular ways. So that's my general thoughts on the last year of. I'll also say I was probably a little loose with one of the players wanted to go with a very non-violent approach to their space fighting. And so I may have let them do more bumps and passes by and stuff to do effects than probably in a legit hard sci-fi game you might have allowed. I don't know. I think it's really good. My takeaway is I think Tachyon Squadron is solid. It's a kind of game we haven't seen for a while. I mean, there used to be a lot of this in the FASA days, Battletech, and even War Machine and things like that. Games where we had some access to crunchy combat ideas. This does it without getting us into the weeds too much. And I think it's a smartly adaptable set of mechanics. I mean, my ulterior motive for running this was I would like to figure out how to use it to do Crimson Skies, to do biplanes fighting and that kind of thing. So overall, I liked it.
Would you say that the non-plane or vehicle rules, were they sufficient for doing all the other things that adventuring pilots might be doing?
I think so. So I think it is a game that it could have a nice expansion set of things done for it. Falling back on Fate Core, and Fate Core is robust.
Yep, you can do most stuff. Cool.
I was just very surprised. A sentence that I never expected to hear on the Gauntlet was, I wish this game had a longer equipment list.
Yes. I do, because I love those examples. I have the same thing with Fate of Cthulhu, which you're running right now, Shane. I always want just a little more of a skill list, give us more examples. And I think there's a deliberate choice on the part of Evil Hat to keep that restrained. So it isn't like a splat book, but just a little bit more. All right, listeners, we are going to move to our second segment. Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our PBTA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com. Listeners, in the second segment, I wanted to give each of us a chance to talk about some of our goals, resolutions, the key things that going into 2022 we have on our mind that we want to get done or that we want to do. I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been thinking about how many resolutions I figured out like halfway through 2021 and then didn't do any of those. So I'm trying to be a little more proactive this year. Shane, let's start with you.
I wanted to start this discussion just by reflecting a little bit on my goals from last year and just sort of saying, like, generally I love having goals, New Year's resolutions, things like that. I really enjoy and appreciate. Last year, I talked on this podcast about there's a couple of goals. One was to run a game by a different trans or non-binary game designer each month, and I largely achieved that goal. Listeners know that I only played Knights Black Agent solo ops in December, so I didn't quite get that 12th month in there, but I was happy to just let myself relax and rest a bit by the end of what was a pretty big year. But that goal worked out really well. I got to try games that I probably wouldn't have tried otherwise that turned out great. I'm thinking in particular of Invincible Sword Princess. I don't think I would have played that otherwise, and I really enjoyed it. I ran some games on the Gauntlet that I already liked but might not have actually run for the Gauntlet otherwise, and Visigoth vs. Morgoth, that is one of the most capital F fun games that I know, so I was really happy to get that. And I'd always been so daunted by the Fate rules, but I pushed myself to run iHunt, and that ended up being my absolute favourite game of the year. So the goal worked out really well for me. That said, when you proposed this topic for the podcast today, I was thinking about what my goals for this year might be, and I saw a tweet from a journalist on Twitter named Tina Vasquez, and she says, I do not have 2022 goals. I will not strive. I will not manifest. I will not set any expectations. I'm taking it one day at a time. And that feels very much like my energy for 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about goals here, last year I was like, here are my goals, make sure I achieve them, shame me if I don't. These are not that sort of goals. These are some things that I think would be fun to do this year, but if I decide in 2 weeks' time that I don't care about any of them, that's also okay.
100%.
The first one is that I'd really like to explore Forged in the Dark more. I've sort of nipped around the edges of Forged in the Dark games, some that I think are like further from the core of that system, like extracurriculars or quietus, one-shots that I've played. I'd like to play a quarterly or a campaign-length Forged in the Dark game. I've bounced off a lot of the kind of genres for some of the main games that have come out in that system. You know, Blades in the Dark, a lot about the rules seems cool, but that's not steampunky heists, not quite for me. You know, Scum and Villainy, I'm not a big sci-fi person. So, you know, I haven't really found a game that I was very excited about. I think at this point I'm the only co-host on this podcast who hasn't played the Twilight Throne, so I am very excited. Oh, I'm sorry, while shaking his head. I stand corrected.
No, it's okay.
We don't feel left out at all.
Here's me from the other room cackling maniacally during my game. Yeah.
I am pretty excited for that. Ray, if you're listening, you probably are listening. I'm very excited for that. I expect to throw that up as a quarterly on the calendar as soon as it's available. Another thing, so I kind of started this whole section by saying these aren't exactly goals, but this one is even more like, is this really a goal? Is this more like a white whale just to pursue through my life in gaming? And that is like a kind of epic length cosmic horror campaign. I find myself so fascinated by these games, like Masks of, I refuse to learn how to pronounce these names, Nyarlathotep, whatever it is the classic example, like Eternal Lies for Trail of Cthulhu. I find the idea of these games very appealing. Call of Cthulhu rules are not really to my taste. You know, I'm not really sure that Trail of Cthulhu is something that I would want to play out over a long time. So, you know, thinking a lot about whether I want to sort of hack one of these games or make some small changes and then run something that already exists, or whether I need to come up with something myself. I think there's a lot of scope for like a fun sort of carved from Brindlewood cosmic horror campaign epic. I think that could be something that would be fun to play with and do. But yeah, some sort of variation, some sort of endless campaign where you're slowly unearthing the vast and terrible cultic conspiracy to destroy the world. I would really like to do that at some point. One thing that I found really rewarding in 2021 and would like to do more of this year is to play with more people who are new to the Gauntlet. It's just always a nice time for me if somebody in a game that I'm running is new to the Gauntlet. It's not that long ago that I myself was new to the Gauntlet and was benefited so much from the generosity of the other players and GMs in those games. It's very exciting for me to introduce new people. At one of the GCOGs last year, I played with someone who had never played any role-playing game before, so that was also very exciting. So yeah, I definitely like to put some games on the calendar that are specifically for new people. If anyone is listening and is finding that they're struggling to get into games on the Gauntlet, you're welcome to send me a message on Twitter and I'll try and hook you up, especially if that 10 a.m. Australian Eastern time slot that I like so much is going to work for you. My Twitter is @Shane_Marble. You are genuinely welcome to send me a message and I'll do my best to accommodate you. I mean, I think about this all the time when I'm like putting games on the calendar. Like on the one hand, I really want to play with new people. Like there are still so many people on the Gauntlet that I haven't gotten to play with who I'd really like to play with. But then on the other hand, there's all these people that I have played with that I really want to play with more. Like it's just a constant tension. But I just want to make that situation worse by introducing more people to the dynamic.
Right.
One thing that I'm interested in is trying out a lot more fantasy games. That hasn't really been my genre of choice for a few years now, but there's all these, I mean, mostly newer fantasy systems that I'd really like to try out, especially at like one-shot length. I'm not quite ready to dump into a fantasy campaign, but I would love to find myself one-shots of things like, Mork Borg, that my old friend Dave is obsessed with now, Swords of the Serpentine, Heart, Spire, you know, those resistance system games. Sword Without Masters sounds really cool to me. And what else? Troika. I mean, some of those maybe even more like sort of core OSR-ish games like Dungeon Crawl Classics, things like that I would be into trying out. So yes, again, I'm just going to appeal to our listeners for all of these things. If anyone on the Gauntlet is thinking of running any fantasy one-shots along those lines, I would be very interested. And just briefly, I wanted to talk about game design as a goal. Last year, one of my goals was to get a game to the point of play testing it. And I did achieve that, first with a smaller game about a TV show, and then with a kind of carved from Brindlewood Passiona's hack, Sherri, you played in, about Baywatch detectives. And what I learned from that experience was that I enjoy the process of game design, that I enjoy like making little bits and bobs that will be fun to play with at the table. But when I thought about like trying to like refine that and actually write it down into a text that other people could take away and use to play a game, I have no interest in doing that. That sounds like an absolute nightmare. So definitely interested in like producing some hacks that I can play, put on the calendar, things like that. But that, I just want to be clear, is the extent of my game design ambition, and I will not be kickstarting, I will not be crowdfunding, will not have my own itch page, but hopefully some fun things that we can play together.
Awesome. Sherri.
I really like Shane's take on the goals. I think that for me, 2021 was projects and games. Like, I had a work project, it never stopped. It just got worse some weeks and, less worse others, but it's still ongoing. It should be done in March, at which point I would like to think that I will get a little bit of my mental self back. But so I consider 2021 a wash, but when I look back, I played a lot of games. So clearly, the only things I was doing was work and games. This year, I've worked on a game. It's called Neo Shinobi Vendetta. It's a game about sweet ninjas in a strange future metro place, a last bastion of humanity that is run by corporate interests. It might be dystopian, but it doesn't look like it because you're sweet ninjas. I have worked on that game off and on, but I had to put it aside for all of 2021, and I'm looking forward to getting back to it because having played The Twilight Throne, I've seen a lot of tech that I think could really bring those themes forward that I was trying to work on with those, where they're more manifest and more delicious to grab a hold of and start using right from the get-go. So I've learned so much from the play that I had this year that I think coming back into trying some, right now hacking, you're right, absolutely right, Shane, about that. There's the hack stage and then there's the design stage. And those two, there's a big jump between those. But I definitely want to get the hack worked out and then move on, maybe, if people like it, to actually making the text.
Can I just say, I'm
Yes?
a total hypocrite about this because I will not be like releasing any of my games for other people, but I want everyone else to do that so I can play them.
Yes.
You know what? We'll have a full-featured character keeper. So if you're willing to go with that, the gauntlet, that's most of like when we give a play test, it's like, oh, here's a character keeper. You should have enough to go on. If you have any questions, just say. It will definitely be in that shape. And it's a pretty slick character keeper, so it will have most of the things in it. So that I will have. But I think other than that, through 2021, I played with essentially a very core set of GMs. And that was just because it was in my comfort level and I didn't have to think too much about getting settled up in those games. But I need to reach out a little bit more and play with more people, play with different GMs. I just didn't have the mental capacity for that in 2021. And so I'm looking forward to that. So that's real easy. Just play with more people and work on the game that I started well before 2021.
Absolutely fair. I'll start tailing off from what you said for my goals here. I have a couple of different games that are in bad shape that I'd like to fix up. The Changeling the Lost PBTA game. I've got my Magic Inc. game that's about corporate drones in a modern sorcerer's corporation that I've done in a couple of different versions. I'd like to do that. The Danger Unexploded Spell, which is my essentially spell bomb disposal, people in a fantasy city under siege. Those are ones I want to get done, as well as the very last tuning on the supplements for Hearts of Wulin, the stretch goals, and then we've added some additional material onto that. So I want to get that done. And I think I started work on this last year. I promised myself I would get at least one of them out, but I've got the 3 volumes of my collected stuff from the blog like laid out, but I need to do more editing passes and I need to do a few more changes to it. And I've written a bunch more stuff that I can add into it. So I've got to get those done. And at least one of the History of RPG series put into a book form. So those are like concrete things that I want to get done. There are a bunch of games that I want to play, but I'm afraid if I say them out loud, I'll jinx them. That seems to be the case. But I've gotten a bunch of good Kickstarter things that I'm excited to try. But the Gauntlet stuff that I'm really excited about, we're going to do at least 2 GCOGs this year. We've got one coming up in March. I'm excited. I love it because we always see new people and we always see new games and things in there. We've got the Gauntlet Gameway program, which is essentially giving RSVP priority access to marginalized players, gamers, or those suffering from financial hardship. We've still got lots of room in that. I'd love to get more people in, especially designers in those categories who might come and play, see new things, and then play test with us. That's really important to me. And then we're going to try, I think I said this in the last podcast, so I'm really jinxing myself definitively in this. We're going to try, I think, kicking off in late March to do a game jam with on the Gauntlet. We've talked about a couple of ways of doing that, maybe a Hearts of, or just as a theme for it. The other thing that occurs to me is a Character Keeper game jam would be amazing, where it's everything just is in the keeper. Like, that's all it is. That might be super fun. So those are all things I want. I want things to go smoothly on the Gauntlet. That's I want us to get regular content out, and everything to be fine, and nothing to catch fire. I think that's a reasonable one. I also want to make sure that throughout this year, we don't go too long on these recordings so that Rich doesn't send me a nasty note. That's a 2022 goal.
Here.
That in mind, let's move on to our third segment. Listeners, in our third segment, we are each going to discuss something that is lately inspiring us or giving us joy. So, Shane, what is giving you life?
Look, it's not anything particularly new. I just before Christmas finished a long binge of The Sopranos, the classic organized crime drama TV series, sitcom, whatever you want to call it. Widely regarded as one of the greatest TV shows of all time, so I don't think I'm telling you anything like really new by saying it was really great. Certainly that last season gets a bit rough when they decided to make it twice as long and pad it out with an intensely homophobic storyline to no real benefit. But still, just a great show, really worth watching. I did finish it, like I said, just before Christmas, and it coincided with kind of a quiet week at work, and that's how I ended up drafting a Sopranos hack of Hearts of Wulin that is on the calendar to playtest in February.
Love it. Sherri, what is giving you life?
So, this is actually terrible, but a lot of times at the end of the workday, I just kind of collapse on the couch and I watch whatever Lowell is watching. So what has been giving me life lately is that he's been watching all of Poirot, the collected mysteries on, is it on Hulu? What is it on?
I bought for 99 cents the BritBox channel on Amazon Prime.
Yes, 99 cents well spent. We have watched every single one of those. And I love the terrible ones just as much as I love the fabulously done ones. They're just so good and so classic. I read all of those like when I was in 5th grade, like every Agatha Christie. I read every Agatha Christie story there was. And so it is very fun to like match those up against my 5th grader memory of the mystery. And it's just really fun to see all the manners, and the acting is fun and good. And sometimes the episodes are done on the cheap and you can tell, or they had a new director and they hadn't quite gotten their legs under them. And it was just, when you watch it all in one big stream like that, you can see all of those little eccentricities. It's been very fun to do and brainless. And sometimes that's just what you want after a day at work.
Absolutely. It's well known, I love wuxia drama, and one of the best of those is The Untamed, which has been on Netflix, and I think you can find it on Amazon Prime as well. That is actually based on a modern web novel that's huge and hugely popular, and now I think 7 Seas, I can't remember the name of the publisher, but they've put out an English translation of the first part of this that's based on a Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation. And I got it yesterday. I'm almost done. reading it. It's a big novel. I've read a bunch of the Jin Yong novels, the Condor Heroes and those are very 1950s, 1960s mannered style. This is a much more modern feel, and it's fun, and it's a lot of boy love and the kind of attraction, the beautiful people. There's a little bit of stuff with a little bit of homophobia, but I can't tell how much that's being commented on in a negative light and how much that to be contrasted with what's going on with the real affection between these two lead characters. And I'm enjoying it hugely. I think it's a delight, and if you like The Untamed, you should read it. And if you like those wuxia web novels, it's great to have one of them translated English in a very formal way. I know there's a lot of online translations of these, but it's great to have these. So I'm really digging that. Listeners, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening along with us. And you can find out more about the Gauntlet at gauntlet-rpg.com, where you can find articles, podcast info, links to our forums. You can follow us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. If you're interested in playing with the Gauntlet, do check out our forums or check out our Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Remember, the hard part is saying and spelling Gauntlet right, apparently, in this particular episode. If you would consider rating or reviewing our episodes on the podcatcher of your choice, it would really help us. Shane, Sherri, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
And once again, listeners, that's our show.